The JCPOA is over. After the June war with Israel and years of stalled diplomacy, the United Nations has triggered the snapback mechanism, restoring sweeping sanctions on Iran. The European Union has followed suit, reimposing both UN measures and its own nuclear-related restrictions that had been lifted under the 2015 Iran deal. Now, Iran's economy has slid into recession. Inflation is above 40%, and the rial has collapsed. Yet the government is expanding military spending and channeling resources to the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So what does this mean for Iran's economy, its politics, and its future under pressure? To discuss, I'm joined by economist Dr. Mahdi Ghodsi and policy analyst Holly Dagres with the Washington Institute.
The nightmare for the Iranian regime has come.
The blame is on the Islamic Republic for bringing them to this situation where they're experiencing international isolation and sanctions through this nuclear program that most Iranians have not seen the benefit and has arguably brought war to their doorstep.
I'm Negar Mojtahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Economist Mahdi Ghodsi joins us now on Eye for Iran. Thank you for being here, Mahdi.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Likewise, I just got back from New York from the United Nations General Assembly. Obviously, a lot of focus on Iran. Now Iran faces UN, EU, US sanctions all at the same time. How do you assess the economic impact of this moment, and what is the trajectory like?
The nightmare for the Iranian regime has come. And it's like since 2006, there have been numerous and continuous rounds of sanctions being imposed by the UN itself. And then in 2011, 2012, European Union also imposed additional sanctions on Iranian banking sector, oil sector, transportation. It cut Iranian economy from SWIFT or from international transactions. So it was a period of 6 years that those sanctions got intensified. And we see on Iranian economic data that those years were going a bit bad and Iranian economy was slowing down. So all of those sanctions suddenly at the same time, they are reimposed and get back into force. And European Union also reimposed those sanctions. I think it was just yesterday or the day before yesterday. So all of these sanctions have serious effects. Of course, the Iranian government and all of its related or loyalist pundits, they don't argue about the harm of these sanctions, but they will definitely have some harm. So in 2011 or 2012, if you want to consider that, because we can compare today with that time and see if it really pains Iranian economy. So at that time, the countries that were supporting actually the sanctions, the United Nations countries, or any country that supports United Nations and its resolutions, its charters, its legal actions, they stopped trading with Iran. And European Union also stopped trading with Iran. At the same time, there were some countries like China, Emirates, Turkey, Malaysia. These countries have slightly increased their trade with Iran. So it was a kind of rerouting of trade.
What about now? Are they still intact?
So they are still trying to make trade with Iran, but it does not compensate the reduced demand and the reduced trade by other countries. And in addition to that, we have President Trump, who in his first term in office, after withdrawing the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, he did a great job in stopping trade with China. He completely stopped exports of oil from Iran to many countries, including China. So I suppose he will do the same thing. European Union is also doing the same thing at this time around. So I think the pressure is huge on Iranian exports. So Iranian oil will not give revenue anymore to the government. As far as we see also in the data since President Donald Trump took the second term in office, we see his effect on Iranian economy. So just recently there was some new data being published by the Statistics Center of Iran, and it showed that there is already a recession in the spring of this year, which means that the effect of Trump being president is affecting Iranian business environment. There is lower investment, there is lower trade, there is lower exports. Because of lower investment, because of lower exports, there is less revenue, there is higher costs of goods, higher costs of imports. Real depreciated since then, I think by more than, I can't give you an exact number, but since a year ago, it's real depreciated by more than 100%. So it means that the Iranian economy is already under pain, which is completely different from 2011, because in 2011, Iran, at the time of Ahmadinejad, he was exporting oil prior to the sanctions of European Union, and oil prices were huge at that time. So there was a huge revenue coming to Iran just before the sanctions. But now the story is different. There hasn't been much oil revenue excess. By excess, I mean revenue of the government excessively above its expenditure. So the situation is different. Since 2011, gross investment and net investment in Iran has been declining. So the reason behind all of these recession, periodic or cyclical recession in the past a decade or 15 years is exactly because of reduction in capital. Because there's no
So can I interrupt you there? Does that mean that a lot of what we're seeing right now, does that relate then back to these sanctions and the after effects, or how much of it is also mismanagement and corruption from the government itself? Like, how would you assess it as an economist?
Of course, there's a huge amount of mismanagement. I also consider sanctions as the reason or the effect of bad management, bad policy and bad governance. Because if you think about the benefits of your own people and the benefits of society, you don't impose policies that attract sanctions. And as we see, it's about 2 decades of sanctions, and the policymaker in Iran, Ayatollahs, they don't care about society, they don't care about economy. So that's one part of mismanagement and bad governance. Of course, there is a huge amount of low institutional quality, like there's a huge amount of corruption, lack of rule of law, government effectiveness is very low. And we can observe those things in the world governance indicators of the World Bank, that there is a declining trend in all of these institutional qualities. So when we have low institutional quality, it means that production is costlier. You need to pay bribes. You need to pay additional costs that cannot be taken into account transparently. So such costs are, of course, another source of economic downturn. Of course, there is another one, which is prioritizing the budget going through other things rather than investment in productive capacities, like investment in utilities, investment in gas, energy, water resources, in infrastructure completely. So these things have been neglected in the past decade. And that's exactly why, just before the 12-day war that was imposed by Israel on Iran, before that, there was a huge amount of nationwide shutdowns or blackouts of energy, water, and it's cyclical. We observe it in the past few years that there is a huge amount of electricity shutdown. So these are all because of mismanagement. Instead of investment in these things, they were spending on other things like military expenditure, like paying Hose or paying the religious entities in Iran. So that's completely irrational.
Yeah, and the last time we talked about on Eye for Iran, you were talking about how in face of all of this and the sanctions, et cetera, they actually increase military spending.
Exactly. So they increase military spending more than inflation, sometimes by more than 100%, while they were increasing the income or salaries of public employees by less than inflation. So in the past, let's say, I had a calculation which I don't remember exactly, but in the past maybe 10 years or 5 to 10 years, the real income of Iranians have been halved. So these
That's so sad. That's huge.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the middle class has become poor, and the poor cannot live longer under these conditions. So the mismanagement is there. They don't see the full picture of society.
I'm glad that you brought that up about the middle class, because there was a study that I was recently reading about in an op-ed actually on Al Jazeera English, and they were talking about how in their view and in their study that sanctions have shrunk the middle class society by 12 to 17%, and that in doing so and in not having a strong middle class, you will not have a strong opposition or forces against the government, because societies have shown that you do need a strong middle class in order to overcome that type of oppression or repression in society. Well, what do you make of studies like that in terms of sanctions and the impact that it has on the middle class and the importance of the middle class?
Of course, sanctions are affecting society, and at the same time, they're affecting the sources of income by the government. Of course, they try to target governments. The sanctions that are very general, that are targeting the whole economy, they're not smart. So a smart sanction is a sanction that only targets the people or those individuals that are responsible for malign activities, not the society. So if a sanction that is imposed on the Central Bank of Iran does not allow imports of medicine and foodstuffs, that's not a smart sanction. But the reason that such non-smart sanctions or general sanctions are imposed is exactly to reduce the power structure, reduce the power of a country as a whole. So, but of course, it has some negative externalities that spill over to the society, and the society gets affected by that. The middle class income shrinks. As I explained, it might have shrunk by more than 50%. So a salary of a pensioner, the salary of a person who is working for the government is half of what it was 6-7 years ago. And that was exactly the effect of sanctions, because for a country like Iran that has a huge amount of public economy, when you sanction it, there's no private sector. The private sector is very small. The sanctioning entity, the entity that is under the sanction and it is being affected is the government. And the government cannot pay for it. Because the government cannot pay for it, then there's a huge reduction in the middle class. The issue is that society gets poorer. According to many political science studies, in terms of development, countries with political developments are countries that have also economic developments and a certain amount of income per capita. So if income per capita is reduced, then there is less development, then people have less to think about other important issues like politics. So they need to earn for their bread. So that's why they cannot participate in political or activities in the country that could change the regime behavior.
And talk about the latest sanction round that we're seeing after the snapback. Are these, you described, the difference between smart sanctions, targeted sanctions, etc. What are these? Explain it in layman's terms for our audience who may not understand the economy and like you do as an economist. Who does it impact? What sectors of the economy? And very briefly.
Yeah. So a smart sanction is, for instance, if there is a commander in the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps who has killed civilians or who has some activities in Iraq elsewhere, if he is targeted by sanction, that's a smart sanction, because if affecting such a person does not affect the whole society.
But these latest round, is that what this is? Like, is that how you would describe it?
No. So recent rounds of sanctions are general sanctions. So they affect oil sector. They are targeting the sectors that are related to its Iranian missile activity and Iranian nuclear activity. So any product that is considered to be of dual use, they are targeted. So it encompasses many sectors in the economy. So even in the agricultural sector, imagine that you have chemicals that are used for pesticides. So even exports of such products could be targeted by sanctions. So if the sanctioning countries like sending sending countries like the European Union wants to be strict on these things, they don't allow the exports of pesticide to Iran. So the effect of such general sanctions, for instance, another general sanction is sanctioning the central bank of Iran, which the European Union did. So it means that all of Central Bank of Iran's assets in the EU are frozen. So it means that if they want to make any humanitarian transaction, like if they want to import food or medicine from European Union, they cannot do that easily because there's no financial transactions between the Central Bank of Iran and elsewhere. So this will complicate the humanitarian exports and imports for Iran. It does not stop it because the Iranian is very experienced in bypassing sanctions, and what they do is just they establish companies in other countries like Emirates, Turkey, that are not abiding by sanctions, and then through those countries they manage to transfer the product and export and import through a barter trading system.
Yeah, that's what there's a recent report by Iran Human Rights Documentation Center and Iran Wire, and they were talking about how during the 2022 Women Life Freedom movement, because there were sanctions on Iran, what they did is that they were able to get non-lethal weapons coming from companies like in Canada and in the United States, like paintball. They would come to, the Paintball Iranian Association that is allegedly used for games. And then there was like a third party company in Turkey that wasn't sanctioned, or some sort of front company that would bring in the goods and then send it directly to Iran, which was then used to deform a lot of and disfigure a lot of protesters.
Exactly. So there are numerous products that are considered as dual use products. So those will be substantially affected.
So the latest round, like you said, these are general sanctions. They're not necessarily targeted or smart sanctions, like you made that distinction earlier. So what impact will this have on the Iranian government and their ability to do their activities, let's say, nuclear activities, proxies, even repression domestically? And what would this do also to the Iranian people? Because before we started recording, we were talking about how, there's kind of two different schools of thoughts when it comes to the impact of sanctions. Some people say, well, it doesn't hurt people, it only affects the government. And then there are other people who ignore the impact that it has on the government and says, well, it only hurts people. I'm sure the truth is somewhere lies in the middle there.
Exactly. So, of course, we are in a situation that is like a dilemma. Yeah. So Iranian society is now pushed between a hard place and a rock, and it means that not only their government thinks about them, but also the foreign governments do not think about Iranian society, because they will be harmed according to these negative externalities of sanctions. But the revenue side of the government will be affected. So the government will not be able to export oil. So they cannot they cannot spend it as much as they can as it was before. They cannot spend it easily on proxies. They cannot import products that are related to their missile activities, to their nuclear activities. But of course, they are very experienced in bypassing sanctions. So there are lots of covert operations that brought different products and goods to develop this nuclear activity of Iran, despite U.S. secondary sanctions. There are many people like Babak Zanjani who are experienced in this. So despite sanctions, they will find ways to do it. But the amount of it, the amount of their support for proxies in the region, the amount of their budget for all of these activities will be, of course, under a huge pressure. So the Iranian government will be under several on several fronts. It will be under pressure. One front is, of course, UN and many countries in the world that do not want to make trade and investment with the government and also with Iran, but also from its society. So, of course, the society is affected negatively by sanctions, but civil society is still alive. So civil society, in my opinion, is still vibrant. The civil society is continuing its societal disobedience, and that's what we observe in the past, let's say, year, that women are fearless. There are much more rounds of strikes, nationwide strikes, like truckers' strikes that we experienced, I think we observed in the past, let's say, quarter.
Yeah,
So
before the 12-day war in June, just before in June, yeah.
Yeah, so such kinds of activities from civil society exerts ample pressure on the government to change. And that's exactly what the civil society should do. And that's what we need to observe about the response of the government. The government does not enforce hijab law. And that's exactly because the society is pressurizing it. So although society's pocket is shrinking, although the economic conditions for people, for ordinary people, gets harsher and harsher, but they understand that it's not the other governments who should be blamed. It's their own government who they should point a finger at.
And in terms of their own government, how much is this going to limit their, finances and their decision making? And like you said, talk about the kind of their covert operations and being able to evade sanctions in some ways. How much will this affect, I guess, kind of this IRGC black network, underground network, and some of the hardliners?
So because there is a huge pressure on their budget, I think they cannot improve the technology of the military equipments that they have. So by far, Israel and the US have a huge superiority in the technology of their military equipment. So a bullet is not considered to be of high quality or high tech product. So maybe it will continue to the production of those things that are with low quality. And exactly because of high pressure on their income, they cannot easily spend it, because if they don't spend it, especially with Pezeshkian government, if they don't spend it for the people will protest, and people will pressurize them again. So there should be a balance. There should be a balance on the negative effect. So the government will not have an enormous, big budget, and its only pocket, which I call a very deep pocket, that can easily finance its own budget, will be again the Central Bank of Iran. Anytime they want, they will request borrowing from the central bank. Central bank will print money, and that will pressurize again the inflation. So all of these things will have socioeconomic consequences for the government, and the Iranian government will need to make difficult choices after this time.
Will the government change its behavior and make those decisions like you just mentioned, or will they double down?
It's difficult to predict. If it was a hardliner government like Raisi's government, I think they would double down on their enmity with the West, with other countries. But think about it, that it's a reformist government who promised something to the people, who promised removal of sanctions, and just in the contrary, the opposite happened. And there are some rumors that Pezeshkian might step down. And it shows that
Really?
They cannot double down.
Oh, because he wasn't able to keep his promise.
Exactly. So if they want to become more harsher on foreign policy agenda, then I think it's not Pezeshkian who can deliver that.
Interesting. So in this case, do you see these sanctions as, I guess, for lack of a better term, working or not working in terms of like the effect or the impact it will have on the behavior of Iran and the future of Iran and Iran's society? What do you think?
In the long run, the sanctions are pushing the target government, to come to the negotiating table. So that's what we observed in the past year, that the Iranian government tried to establish some negotiation.
And like you said, because you're dealing with hardliners in this case, so to speak, right?
Yeah, but I believe that it was the choice of Khamenei himself to elect Pezeshkian because he was not he was filtered out by the Guardian Council, but then he approved it. He approved him. So it means that it was the decision by Khamenei himself to find negotiation grounds with the United States. Although they were not successful, it means that they didn't do what President Trump wanted, and there were different areas of concern. And across those areas, like the proxies in the region, like missile activities, all of these things are now somehow crushed by Israeli forces. So other issues of concern are somehow dealt with, and they just need to come to their senses and understand that those issues are available for negotiation now. But the reason that they don't do it is, I can say it's stubbornness or ideological stubbornness of the supreme leader. But the long-run effects of sanctions that were imposed by the US since 2018 was pushing Iranian government to the negotiating table. So I think they have long-run effects on both government and the society that is targeted by.
Interesting. And talk to me about the economy right now in Iran. Like, we know it's bad, but just give us a sense of like just how bad is it? And I know that it's often like there's two worlds in Iran, like a paradox, right? Like I was seeing some videos on social media about a new cheese shop that opened up in Tehran that somehow, with all these sanctions even in place, are able to import cheeses that I don't think I have access to in North America from Europe. And they have a DJ and they're serving champagne. So, and then meanwhile, there are dry taps and people who literally, based on their salary, cannot afford food on their table at the end of the month. So it's like two different societies. Give us a view of how bad the economy is right now. And how bad is it going to get under these kind of general sanctions, if it does at all have an impact?
The economy is really bad. It's running very poorly. The inflation is much, much higher than we see on statistics, because from day to day that people go to shops, they observe a huge amount of changes, 10%, 20% within just a day. Because of such inflation, because inflation is beneficial for some of the people who are in trading business, who are even close loyalists to the regime. So it's very beneficial for, let's say, the top decile of income distribution, or for the ones who adjust their salaries with inflation easily, or not even adjust, but adjust more than inflation. So they benefit a lot. But the rest of the society who are constant salary earners, like many employees in Iran, like many employees in Tehran, they cannot adjust their costs with their income anymore. So costs are growing and their income is not growing. So there's a huge amount of inequalities in Iran. And many of the products that like cheese, these are considered to be food, and food is humanitarian good, so there is no sanction against it. The only problem for imports of such goods from different countries is that it's not easy to pay for the imports. So as I mentioned, there is a huge barter trading system that Iran or Iranian government has established across different countries, and that's how they can import
like with
different types of
UAE.
cheese.
Yeah, with UAE,
Exactly.
for example, I was reading in The Economist that most of the UAE, and even in Saudi Arabia, a lot of the groceries are coming from Iran. But then when they package them, it says made in Italy, that it's coming from Italy, for example. But that there's some sort of barter system. They don't pay them back in rials, but can pay them back with, okay, well, we can pay for this equipment or that manufacturing equipment that you need, and et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. So that barter trading system is still there. But I think with the intensification of sanctions, there will be harsher surveillance on such transactions, and those companies will be affected.
So to conclude, life is going to get harder for the average Iranian person, but this is also going to hurt the pocketbook of the Iranian government and will in some way in the long term, especially under this current government being not hardliners and more moderate, so to speak, will force them to the negotiating table and could kind of change the trajectory in the near future. Yes,
but there's another also
caveat
element that we need to consider, and that is that President Trump is very strict. There was a recent leak of information that the Iranian side wanted to negotiate just before the snapback mechanism, and they wanted to do many things. They wanted to promise many things, but at the end, Trump's administration did not accept any of those things. So I think Trump administration is looking for a full surrender and full capitulation of the regime.
What do you mean by full surrender? Like no more Islamic Republic? What does this mean? Or just no more nuclear program?
That's very extreme, but there are, no more Islamic Republic is very extreme, and I'm not sure about that if President Trump is seeking for that. But
he says he's not, according to him. He says he wants to be friends with them if they're willing to play ball.
Exactly. So there are several areas of concerns, and so it's not only about nuclear activity, and all other things should be also discussed.
So where is this headed then?
So
$1 million question.
The most important thing is Israel, and I think unless there is a rapprochement between Iran and Israel, these things will continue. So, and the specter of war is still on Iran. The Iranian airspace is still under control of Israel and the United States. So we are just waiting for next moves of Israel or the Iranian government. So either the Iranian government would try to resolve all the issues, or the tensions will escalate soon.
So these snapback sanctions could potentially lead us down the path to more confrontation, potentially war, is what you're saying.
That's what I'm saying, yes.
Thank you so much. That's Mahdi Ghodsi joining us today on Eye for Iran. Thank you for your time. Holly Dagres from the Washington Institute joins us now. Thank you for being here, Holly.
Thank you for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure. We just spoke with an economist, Mahdi Ghodsi, about sort of the economic impact that this is all having, the UN sanctions. I mean, of course, now we've got the UN, we've got the EU, we've got the US sanctions all at the same time. I wanted to talk to you about the societal impact. What impact is this going to have on the society at large?
Well, these United Nations sanctions are actually targeting the regime itself. They're, in many ways, they're focusing on asset freezes, the ability to sell ballistic missiles. So very much security and focused on the Islamic Republic and its security and military apparatus. When you hear that, you're looking at it and saying, well, this is not going to have an impact on Iranian society. But just the notion, the idea, or the fact that sanctions are snapping back on Iran, that they're returning these 6 key multilateral sanctions on the country that were removed as part of the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, or what we popularly know as the nuclear deal, it actually sends the Iranian currency skyrocketing, and it hurts the purchasing power of the average Iranian. So in the lead up, of course, there's been 30 days since the snapback mechanism had been issued. And in that time span, we saw the Iranian rial lose so much of its worth. So today, it's Wednesday. And right now, it's at 117,000 toman.
Wow.
And so, I mean, just before that, it was less than 1 million, or 100,000 rials and tomans, my apologies. And so Iranians, when they hear the talk of sanctions, they're looking obsessively at the currency rate, at the gold rate, and they're seeing how much their purchasing power, their ability to make a living is being impacted by these sanctions. So I think that it's that psychological aspect coupled with their purchasing power that's really having an impact on the average Iranian.
And based on your knowledge, what is the mood or the vibe kind of like right now in Tehran? I mean, I know often, obviously, journalism is very restricted in Iran, and sometimes you'll see an NBC reporter or a CNN reporter that does, like you've coined the term very well, kind of that parachute reporting. They come in, they talk to a few people that they've been given essentially by the government, 3 or 4 people at a bazaar. But from your knowledge and your connections with Iran and your studies and your expertise, what is the vibe like really in Iran right now with Iranian people with the news of the snapback sanctions, which we expected would happen?
So, I mean, obviously there's a variety of views in a population of 90 million, but I think the overall trend is a lot of the blame is being placed on the clerical establishment for a number of things. There's also been blame put on former hardline President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and his negotiator Saeed Jalili, for example, who were responsible for reviving the nuclear program in the early 2000s. Others put blame on Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, and former President Hassan Rouhani for negotiating the JCPOA. But overall, the blame is on the Islamic Republic for bringing them to this situation where they're experiencing international isolation and sanctions through this nuclear program that most Iranians have not seen the benefit and has arguably brought war to their doorstep just months ago. And it's not just something I'm saying and what I'm seeing in my conversations with people or even on social media. You're hearing chants from retirees in the country. You're hearing this through the labor unions that issued a statement that's saying enough, like, stop blaming sanctions and inflation. This is all on you. And so I think that those messages are really reverberating, and even some of the protest chants from these retirees that have been protesting in recent weeks has reflected that this isn't about the West. The West is not the problem here. You're the problem. And we've been also hearing this revive chant that we've heard for a very long time, which is about who's the enemy, which is, to them, it's not the United States, it's the Islamic Republic. And so this is playing out actually on the streets in Iran. This isn't just something on social media where people can accuse and say that, hey, it's an anonymous account, we don't know who it's behind this account. This is a real issue.
So what would this do then to civil society?
Well, civil society has been struggling for a very long time, as reports from prominent human rights organizations have noted. There's been over 1,000 executions since the month of January, which has been the highest in 15 years. There's been a massive crackdown post-war. There's been some 20,000 arrests. And so civil society has been operating in this environment and has been struggling greatly even before the war. And so, when we talk about civil society, it's very hard to be a civil society activist when you can't afford to live in the same way that the average Iranian can't. But there obviously comes with a lot of, I would say, a lot more burdens in being a civil society activist. So I imagine that activists are having to think twice about what they do as the economy dwindles and inflation continues to skyrocket and they lose their purchasing power.
So would this make the likelihood of protests and nationwide strikes, et cetera, less possible or more possible given the conditions now?
It's hard to say. Historically, sanctions actually have the opposite effect because people are supposed to be thinking about their economic well-being. But also at the same time, you would think, well, if you're struggling financially and you have a government to blame, it makes sense to go out on the streets and protest the government. So, I think regardless of these sanctions, Iran has been in a very precarious situation, especially post-war. I've seen in recent weeks memes and even scenes from the film Titanic be shared on social media to insinuate that the Islamic Republic's a sinking ship. And historically, protests in Iran have not been caused by one single thing. We've seen it happen over a young woman by the name of Mahsa Amini being killed by the morality police. We've seen them over a reformist newspaper being shut down or a triple fuel price hike. So it's really hard to say what will set people off, but the situation on the ground has really left the clerical establishment on edge, and that's why you've actually seen state media downplay the impact of snapback sanctions, because they know that when they do report negatively, it does actually impact the real conversion rate. And so that's also why they hype up nuclear talks with the United States, because it has a positive effect and actually brings the number down. So I think you're going to be, I think that it's an interesting time to be an Iranian, and given the events of the past couple of years, and I'm saying couple of years starting with October 7th, there's been a lot of movement in the country that we didn't think would happen, and especially in the region.
Yeah, and Holly, like you said, Pezeshkian has really been trying to downplay the impact and of the snapback sanctions ever since the UN General Assembly concluded last week. And now this week, Japan has put sanctions on Iran too, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, it's very surprising, if anything, because it seems that Japan has been taking its own initiative, and I think it's a sign of the times that a lot of countries are just really fed up with the behavior coming out of Tehran. And by behavior, I mean they've been playing games on the nuclear talks for a long time, dragging their feet. And I think there's been a real realization that the Islamic Republic's not changing its behavior. It will continue to fund its proxies and build up what it has left of its ballistic and nuclear program. And so I think there's a symbolic feature to Japan's response. There also might be more to it that we just don't know. As we recently came to our attention in recent weeks, Australia cut ties with Tehran over 2 arson attacks. And so there might be more to this Japan story that we don't know, but it just stand out as a story on its own.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting you talk about behavior, because Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi recently said that as long as the United States is the United States, and as long as the Islamic Republic is the Islamic Republic, we will always be at odds with each other. He openly admitted that. But he said at the same time that doesn't mean that they can't have, talks, and that they can't negotiate, but still have that mutual feeling towards each other, if you will. And I want to talk to you also about the Iranian youth, because you specialize in that. Obviously, the Iranian youth is not engaged in politics for obvious reasons. Now, in this current environment, how are younger Iranians reacting, socially, culturally, and in any other ways that you can think of?
Well, I think it's interesting because today news was made that Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian hired a Gen Z advisor. And so there was...
I did not hear about that. That's fascinating.
Yes, and it was brought to my attention because of some of the funny tweets about this Gen Z advisor, including that he dresses more like a millennial than a Gen Zer. He was wearing like his little suit and sort of baggy, oversized clothes that are popularized with Gen Z. But I think it's a sign that the clerical establishment has noted that this is a special generation and that they need more understanding of it. We've never had something like that in the history of the Islamic Republic, but I think it's a showing of the times, and it's just not an Iran thing. We just had these Gen Z protests in Nepal, and Morocco Gen Z's leading protests as well. So I think there's this recognition that we need to pay more attention and have some sort of Gen Z whisperer, although I don't think this person will be successful. But to answer your question, I mean, Gen Z is very much nihilistic. They're hopeless in Iran. There's a sense of things are just getting worse for them. Suicide rates are high. We don't really have enough information about that, but more and more we're hearing those stories go public in viral pictures of unfortunate events, or at least stories. And there's always been a brain drain in Iran, but I think that it's now been exacerbated, especially post-woman life freedom in 2022. And as the situation economically and in terms of repression gets worse, there will be a bigger wave of Iranians trying to flee the country for an array of reasons. And it's because Iranians feel hopeless. This generation, which has so much potential, so much talent, as we saw, just some of them were killed during women life freedom. They're having to,
and are still being killed.
And still being killed, and they have no hope for a future, and so they're taking matters into their own hands, and sometimes, unfortunately, in dark ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Even some of the younger generation that are more aligned with the regime per se, and I only say that because when I'm watching like state TV, and sometimes I've been seeing some debates amongst kind of the younger generation of the Iranians that they allowed to go on stage. That's why I said, affiliated with the regime in some way. And a lot of the discussions are pretty interesting in the sense that they're recognizing that this Qasem Soleimani's ring of fire that he created around Israel and putting all of the stock into these proxies in the end didn't really do much for them. And this is something that they're openly talking about right now on state TV debates that, what was the point of all of that? Did Hezbollah come to their saving after the 12-day war, and that they need to rethink their sort of strategic and economic outlook. So it's really a sign of the times to see that coming from that level of society. And like you said, like the younger generation that could help in some ways, maybe, I don't know, don't want to use the word reform, but change things in some ways in terms of the day-to-day outlook.
In terms of change, I know a lot of commentary is that Iran is on a precipice of changing and doing something big. And I know that that's been some of the conversation from the clerical establishment. We've also seen like the reformist front put out that statement a couple months ago saying that there needs to be big reforms made to change the country or else it won't survive. But then big picture, you look at characters like Nobel laureate Negar Mojtahedi or Green Movement leader Mir Hossein Mousavi, who's been under house arrest since 2011. They don't subscribe to this idea of reform. They think reform's dead. And from an analytical perspective, I think they're onto something for sure. And Iranians have felt this for a very long time. And I think that's why protests came to head in 2022, because they felt there was no hope, there was no change. And so, it's nice that they're having these very public discussions, trying to show that they have nuance. But as long as Khamenei and the Islamic Republic as it exists, I just don't see reform being a possibility. They've had numerous chances to do that. And it seems like they're only doubling down on their repression. And so, because in their view, if they give an inch, people will ask for a mile. And they saw this through the Shah and his last-minute reforms, and they believe that that's what helped topple the regime. So I just find it hard to believe that the clerical establishment would want to do a 180. So I don't see it going down a path of reform. I think that's been dead long ago.
In terms of reform being dead, do you see some changes on a societal level in terms of how Iran functions so that the regime can survive itself in that sense? Like, putting less stock into their proxies, for example, trying to come to some sort of compromise on the nuclear front. Do you see the snapbacks and this general sanctions that it's been described as pressuring the government to do so? Would it lead to that kind of change? Not necessarily reform or that the Islamic Republic is having some sort of facelift, but in terms of the overall outlook of the government itself and how they allocate their finances.
Well, the Islamic Republic just had a 12-day war and then these snapback sanctions, and they had an opportunity, from my understanding from the European side, they had ample opportunity. The Europeans for months offered them things, and it wasn't until last minute that the Iranians offered the same thing but a watered-down version. And so in some ways they were insulting the intelligence of the Europeans and wasting time per usual. And they had an opportunity and they didn't take it. And that's why we have snapback sanctions. So to me, if you're stuck in a corner the way the Islamic Republic is, especially given recent events, like you would take some sort of deal. But to them, that's capitulation. And they would rather, I think they would rather die on the hill they're on and bring the country down than do some sort of deal, that would help them survive. It wouldn't be great for them, but it would help them survive. And so I think a lot of it's driven by pride.
So if they're that stubborn, then what could the ultimate outcome be of the sanctions? Would it achieve its goal of of having any changing the behavior, for example, or is it just then to financially constrain them in that way? Like, what do you see as the kind of overall goal of this being implemented?
Well, I think it's more symbolic in nature. I haven't seen thus far this real talk about implementing them. We have to remember that a lot has changed since the JCPOA was signed. Iran might be isolated on a Western front, but it's not isolated on an Eastern front, and that was in part because they did this whole pivot towards East. So yes, China and Russia didn't come to their aid during the war, but Iran is heavily intertwined with Russia and China as allies. So they're going to be looking to them to help evade sanctions. And Iran has done a good job of joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They've joined BRICS. So they're going to be leaning more on these developing countries in the world and the great power countries to help navigate this space. So it really depends on what the West wants to do. How serious are they going to implement these sanctions? Does that mean they're going to sanction those countries? And
like secondary sanctions, right? On anyone who supports them.
Yes. So we haven't really seen talk about that thus far. So I think that will really determine how serious these sanctions impact the Islamic Republic.
And how much can Russia and China, notwithstanding secondary sanctions, like you mentioned, that we don't know the full results of that yet, how much can it actually do for the Islamic Republic of Iran? And would they want to? Would it be in their interests?
Well, we've had China being a top buyer of oil from Iran. For years, we've had them buying blended oil and taking part in these ghost oil tankers. So they've been really good at helping with the sanctions evasion. The Russians and Iran both being internationally sanctioned, they're not really going to lose much on that front. They're going to probably have to just deepen their ties, which they've already been doing since the Ukraine war began. So you're not going to be seeing that much nuance than from before. But it's still a pressure of some sort on Iran at the end of the day, because we don't know how hard they're going to do the secondary sanctions. And as I mentioned earlier, it's that purchasing power, that psychological impact that really hits Iranians hardest.
And when it hits them hard this way, what will it do to them per se? Would it lead to more of a brain drain, people trying to get out of the country, more discontent coming from them towards their own government, who they're blaming for, these policies that led to the sanctions in the first place? The President Pezeshkian has warned of unrest. Like, how likely are we to see that? And maybe even a revival of what we saw before the 12-day war, which was the truckers' protest, which a lot of people had a lot of stock and a lot of hope and faith into that. But in the end, not much came of it ultimately. And now we've got this hunger strike that's devastating news coming from political dissident Hossein Ronaghi that's making a lot of headlines. You can tell us all about that.
Hossein Ronaghi, thankfully, has been released on furlough, but he's technically not free and is being treated in hospital for his hunger strike. There's been over 20 hunger strikers in Gharuchak prison, and it's tied to prison conditions and the deaths of several political prisoners who were neglected or denied medical care. So that's ongoing. I think the big picture, and you kind of highlighted it in your question, is that regardless of these UN sanctions returning, the situation on the ground has not improved. It's worsened. And we just had a 12-day war. Now we have snapback sanctions. I would say the fog of the war has dissipated, and Iranians are looking around and they're saying, okay, well, our problems are still there. Nothing's changed. It's getting worse now. We had a war. We have snapback sanctions. And they're recognizing that their problems are systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression. And who causes them? It's the Islamic Republic. It's not the United States or Israel. And so I think that is the continued realization that Iranians have, one that I frankly hasn't changed. It's just added more to their anger and frustration about their situation at hand.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, Holly, in terms of where you feel this is all headed. The economists that I spoke to believe that it may lead to more confrontation, potentially more strikes from Israel coming. And he kind of had a bleak assessment and darker days. What do you make of it?
I think he really hit home on that because you just don't see any way out. The proxies are continuing to be funded. Iran's trying to build what's left of its ballistic missile bases, and it's trying to reconstitute or salvage its nuclear program in some shape or form, at least according to reports. So to me, it seems like things are not changing in the view of the Islamic Republic. And the way that things are going, it does look like a path of confrontation. I don't know anyone, average Iranian, or even when you read statements from Iranian officials, that doesn't think another war is coming. And I think that it lingers in the back of everyone's mind. Some Iranians have packed bags, so in case they need to flee the capital again. Others have stocked up on food, and those that are really well-to-do have bought second homes in other places in the country just in the event that that does happen. So I think it really tells you about the state of mind of Iranians, that this is wartime, and it hasn't died just because a ceasefire was implemented.
So the human toll is sounds like it's quite devastating. The human toll.
It very much is, and I think that it's not the bloody 8-year war with Iraq, but it still is war, at least for people living in Tehran, the capital, and it's left psychological effects on people, ones that I don't think will go away as long as this wartime exists.
Yeah, and just to conclude, none of this is at this point in time going to lead to some sort of uprising, it doesn't sound like. Especially because you hear a lot from anytime I interview any Israeli official and I ask about the possibility for regime change, they always say, well, that's up to the people of Iran. And but I don't, based on what you're describing, what the economist said in terms of the environment, the economic environment and the hardships, it doesn't sound like civil society is going to be able to rise up and against the regime in this kind of setting.
I wouldn't say that, just because, as I noted earlier, nothing has, like, Iran's always full of surprises. Things have popped off because of no rhyme or reason.
Yeah, you never know what that trigger is, right?
We don't know what trigger could be it. And I think it's no different right now. Yes, civil society is weakened, but usually it's just some angry person that starts shouting in the streets that starts everybody up. And that's where it takes things. So I wouldn't put stock in saying that protests are dead. I think Iranians are protesting every day, whether by not abiding by mandatory hijab or chanting women life freedom out their windows to mark the anniversary. So I think, or even these hunger strikers, that's an act of protest. So to me, just because we're not seeing the masses of people doesn't mean people aren't angry and aren't expressing their anger. And so I think you're going to be seeing different iterations of that as time continues. But I also wouldn't be surprised if things do pop off at some point in the country and people start protesting, because Iran is a paradox, and we're all trying to understand it every day as analysts and journalists, and it's always something surprising that gets you.
Yeah, that element of surprise, it's a really important point, because when I spoke with Professor Abbas Milani a few weeks ago, of course, he's a renowned Iranian historian. For those who don't know, he said, you know what, these are all forms of resistance. The woman who goes out and doesn't wear her hijab, the person that attends a concert and dances, this is all like, these are the resistance fighters. This is the opposition. And when I spoke with Len Khodorkovsky from the Trump administration also a few weeks ago, he was with the first Trump administration, and he's of Russian origin. He's like, well, nobody could predict the fall of the Soviet Union, right? And he's like, you can't predict revolutions. It's just something that is impossible to do, but the conditions are all there. And it's just a matter of, like you said, like that trigger, right? Who would have thought with Mahsa Amini that would have started a revolution of its own, or the women life freedom movement?
And just to build off of that, Dr. Ali Ansari at St. Andrews says we're in a pre-revolutionary phase. And I think the reason why it's so hard to read or predict sometimes these big events, like the Arab Spring, for instance, is because a lot of people in government and in think tanks spend time talking to their counterparts. They're not talking to activists or people on the ground. They're talking to officials, people that have their own narratives or agendas, or there's a language barrier. But you talk to people on the ground, to activists, they will tell you this is what they're seeing and this is what they're feeling. And we should be paying attention to them. You shouldn't be paying attention to people that meet with Araghchi and then tell you what Araghchi says. Of course, you're going to get that version of events. So, and I think that when people are like, oh, you couldn't have predicted the Arab Spring. No, you could have. You just were too busy talking to the Egyptian government under Hosni Mubarak and appeasing an ally. You weren't talking to the activists in Egypt. Or you weren't reading the United Nations Development Report from 2010 that told you how dire the situation was in the region, especially for the country's youths. So, I mean, I think there's some real telltale signs, but sometimes people ignore them. And I think the signs for Iran have been there for a very long time. They started with the December 2017-2018 protests, which also marked the beginning of women taking off their mandatory hijab on electrical boxes, popularly known as دخترای خیابون انقلاب, or the Girls of Revolution Street. So you started seeing these trends from then onwards, and you saw things come to head eventually during Women Life Freedom. So, and to me, or any analyst that was actually paying attention to the mood on the ground, they could tell you why they were angry. That's why I was studying Gen Z before Women Life Freedom, and I ended up, I was writing a report before the protests kicked off because I saw an anger I hadn't seen before and a frustration that I hadn't seen in my generation, millennials, when I was growing up in Iran. So I think you just have to pay attention, and unfortunately not everyone's paying attention right now, again, because they misread what's happening in the country, especially post-war.
And what, can you elaborate on that? I know you spoke a little bit earlier about the vibe and kind of the mood on the ground. What are you hearing from the people on the ground inside Iran in terms of something that really stands out to you that you could share with us? It's an important point in terms of understanding where we're at right now in Iran.
Well, I think that there's this misreading of a so-called rally around the flag effect. I think that Iranians definitely don't want their country invaded or bombed. But I think there's this assumption that Iranians are running into the arms of the regime and looking to them as their savior. But Iranians weren't rallying around the flag of the Islamic Republic. They were rallying around the soil, Khaki, or their homeland, their Vatan. And so I think there's a real big misread about that because, as I've noted earlier, Iranians are seeing that the clerical establishment is to blame for much of their problems. And so I think that is the key. If you understand that where Iranians are placing blame and how their views of reform are, which they believe is mostly dead, I think then you can understand how Iranians are approaching this future of their country, and they don't see it in a good place. And so it's because of the situation on the ground that the Islamic Republic has created for its people.
Well, thank you so much for relaying that very important message from people on the ground inside Iran. That's Holly Dagres joining us now on Eye for Iran.
Thank you for having me.
You can sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. We deliver what you need to know with top stories, key analysis, and exclusive reports direct to your inbox. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, you can head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.